I offer a short prayer before we begin. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be acceptable to you, my rock and my redeemer. Amen. So I got to join this morning as we were reading The Heart of Christianity by Marcus Borg, and I'm having a lot of fun with it. And I'm so glad you guys are reading it. We'll see where the book study unfolds, but there's so many important conversations. And in particular, in terms of how we think about not only our faith, but also the language you use to communicate this faith. Because my thinking is, and certainly I've experienced this with my college students, there's been kind of a breakdown between the words we use and their intelligibility or the way they're understood by my college students. And I'll give an example. I used to do pulpit supply in Sydney, Montana. Would drive from Billings to Sydney. That's quite 4 hours. But between Glendive and Sydney, there is a series of billboards that this rancher has. And these billboards are all in white letters or white background with giant black letters, bold. And some of them are scriptural passages, and some of them are religious statements. There must be, it's like Burma Shave. There must have been like 5 or 6. You kind of are looking for them after a while. They kind of tell you where you're at between, in particular, Glendive and Savage. Now, if you were to talk to the rancher, he's very involved with churches, and in fact, actually, apparently has some connection with the Baker UCC there. He's clearly trying to spread the good word, the good news to drivers. And I will say that when I've driven up, I start thinking about the Bible. I start thinking about kind of questions of faith as I'm driving up. But I have to admit, I try to put on the hat of a 19-year-old college freshman as they're driving by. And partly it's the aesthetic again, the white backdrop with the big black letters, thus saith the Lord, right? The one that I remember in particular is there's this billboard that says, the ways of the Lord are right. But when you make it in that font, it's a declarative, right? It's a declaration. And the thing about it is, there's a slight form of menace to it when it's that kind of declaration, because if there's a certain sense of if God said it, I believe it, that settles it. That's kind of what I think some of my students get when they come across those kind of signs. There's a lot of religious language that does that. They seem to act in a way to make declarations, and we're just supposed to kind of just deal with it. But it's not very invitational for folks who are not familiar with that language, and it doesn't spur the one thing that my students are really driven by. And I say that my students, but I actually say members of this church too, because, and that's been clear through the studies, and that is, well, where's the space for questioning? Within that kind of context. Where's the space for doubts? Where's the space for where people can kind of figure out what they believe and on their own terms? And so I propose something that I pass on to you. I mentioned about predicates during the children's moment. So there's this thing, if you Google, it's called like predicate theology. But what you do is you take whatever religious statement you make, and especially any statement you make about God, are going to be what you call predicates. But the basic idea is, so you say something like, God is love. In predicate theology, you can actually reverse it. Love is God, right? God is kindness, or there's a wideness in God's mercy, right? God is merciful. Mercy is an experience of God. You can flip the terms. God is the creator. And so whenever you see creation, you've in fact encountered God, which is why that is such an important question we give the students at Mimanagish. Where did you see God? They were literally walking out, and is it Mount Holly? But you're literally seeing this, right? Like you're being confronted with nature in a really powerful way. So whenever you hear a religious term, you can flip it. Even if it's a religious term you're unfamiliar with or you wouldn't use. I did this with a presentation one time. And it could, because you can do this with almost anything. Somebody had a list on Facebook. It was meant to be devotional. And it was like, God stills you, God gives you peace, God gives you acceptance. And then it was in white. And then in black, it was, and Satan confuses you, and Satan upsets you, and Satan tears, all this. Not all traditions are so ready to use the words about Satan. But again, if you flip it around, we know what it's like to be confused. We know what it's like to be accused. We know what it's like to have those destructive patterns. And you can say, well, that is, in fact, demonic. And we know what it's to talk about love or any of these other predicates, and that's what it means to talk about God. But what this does is it creates a space to raise questions. So, for instance, if the ways of the Lord are right, then it creates a question. Well, what is right? Well, then my students and I, we can sit down and go, well, let's talk about what makes things right in the world. What makes a good action a good action? What makes a situation into a just situation? And it creates a space for exploration. So that religious claims, instead of shutting people down, because often it can act that way. Somebody just drops a religious claim on you and you go, well, that's nice. I'm glad you have your strong beliefs, It can shut things down. But rather, in a more invitational way, to say, oh, well, if the ways of the Lord are right, then the ways of rightness are of God. So let's talk about what that means. Or God is love. Okay, that's, everybody that does 1 Corinthians 13, the description of what is love. And if we learn something about the character of love, then we should learn something about the character of God. So these become invitations to inquiry for my students. And now religious language is a discussion starter. It's not a conversation stopper. Now, a lot of times when students are reflecting on these questions, obviously they're drawn from their own lives. And sometimes that's a rich source as they think about, well, where have I experienced love, or where have I experienced creativity? And I quote to you the theologian Agatha Christie when she was reflecting about where she found God. She found God in creation. And she writes, when one sees the wonderful things human beings have fashioned, they've been creators. And so they must share a little of the holiness of the Creator who made the world and all that was in it and saw that it was good, but he left more to be made. So in the creative process for Agatha, writing in her stories was a way to have an experience or an encounter with God. And so my students have lives that are rich, and you all have lives that are rich for reflecting. If anybody's ever been in agriculture, for instance, or has any kind of background, engaged, or naming the animals that were in one's life, right? You are confronted with creation and what that looks like, and care on what that looks like. So I try to start with where students are at in terms of, tell me about yourselves, because if I know about you, then I'll know something about the framework by which we can think about these religious questions. And that starts with the assumption that everybody has an encounter with God, and everybody has something to teach us about God. And that's why we don't have to be fearful of different traditions, and we kind of talked about that this morning as well. Or folks who come from no tradition, which is most of my students. They've never grown up in a church. And so some of this language is new. But as a basis of reflection, it does, in my mind, make a difference if you've had experiences of the world of safety And if your life has not been a chaos. And in that sense, I've had some students who've had some very chaotic lives because, families that are dealing with addiction or poverty or safety issues or violence or the parents have to move I worked used to be a special ed sub, and you'd see a kid for like a week and they went off to another school. That kind of chaos can create a situation where it's hard to have the pillars. If you don't have the pillars, it's hard then to reflect of what did these images of God mean. And the one, I had a 16-year-old so I had a college student who, when she was 16, was thrown out of her home because she was trans, because that's what Jesus wanted. And she was pretty upset at the church. In fact, religious languages make her cringe, like she's under attack. And I was so amazed that, Mayflower was going to do a dinner for the college students, Mayflower and Billings. And they did. And we're all gathering and we're all giving out our names and backgrounds to each other. And this student goes, I am a proud atheist, and I am trans. And everybody at Mayflower was like, we're so glad you're here. We're so glad you wanted to be part with us and to share this food together. Now, I can't say that she became a Christian, from that. But for a moment, she experienced grace as an expression of what church can look like. And my hope is that forever forms kind of her sense of church and the possibilities of grace that exist in the world, in a world that doesn't always have it very often. I had a friend who kind of grew up in the who grew up in the foster care system. Lots of chaos, right? Because you're moving from home to home. But religious language was used not in an abusive way, but just as a way to kind of pat you on the back and say, well, God will never give you too much. God will never give you something you can't handle, which you may have heard. But, life kind of sometimes has other plans, right? So God language then becomes a way for her. She experienced it as a way in which people avoid hard topics, unpleasant topics, not wrestling truthfully about things that are going on in the world, which is really unfortunate because I think the Bible actually does a lot of that, wrestle with the really tough things. And so language can sometimes it's very invitational. Some people, my memories of church is God loved me, and we're mentioning that I don't remember. There's very little content I remember from my confirmation class. I remember worksheets and homework and the projector slides, And apparently we learned names like John Knox because I grew up Presbyterian, and John Calvin, and I don't remember anything. I remember they gave me a Bible, but I remember the teacher who I actually am connected to because she's still involved at that church I grew up in. And I remember how I felt, and I knew I had a lot of grandmothers who were looking after me in that church. And it makes a difference. That's the feeling I have. And so religious language for me fills me with, not all religious language, but when I'm in church here and I'm singing hymns that I know and we're saying the Lord's Prayer, I'm safe. I'm in some of my students don't experience that, right? And they're stained glass windows and they're ready to run out the door. Actually, we had a dinner at First English Lutheran in Billings, and we had a Thanksgiving potluck with the students. And I had a student, as we walked into First English, say, is God going to strike me with lightning because I'm in a church? Like, that's kind of a childhood image of God that that person must have, right? But if I'm going to quote something like the Psalms that were read, my help comes from the Lord who made heaven and earth. Or the Lord will keep you from all evil, and he will keep your life. You're coming and you're going. It needs a framework for that to make sense, for those words to make sense. And the argument, which I think is in the Borg book as well, is just that if people have the experience of support and care, then when you talk about God's love and you talk about God's care, they don't seem empty. They seem like real words. They refer to something. They provide content to faith. Now, not faith as in propositions, because, when you go to seminary, you get your reading syllabus gets quite large, of lots of theologians who debated all sorts of terms. Remember Doug Johnson when he preached here? He told me that when he was ordained, he was asked if he believed in supralapsarianism. I can't tell you what that means, actually. I forgot. I give this example and I can't remember, but it's a doctrinal term that people really debated with each other in the 1600s. So there's some volumes on this. I am certain of this fact, but that and useful and intellectually stimulating and exciting if you get into kind of those schools of thought. But for the work of the church and the work of Christian faith, it's more that fundamental sense of, do you feel safe, or do you feel like you are loved, or do you feel that kind of context? And because if you do, then there's the space to question, there's a space to doubt, and there's a space of one perhaps going back. We talked about the youth program that meets in this church. This is like a memorable time for some of these kids, and they walk into this building and they walk into this church, and this is the experiences they have, and what will that mean for them as they undergo their life? Will they have a sense of God's love and God's safety? This is that's to be honest, my evangelism with college students. I love it when my students want to go to church. I actually had students come up to me like, we want to read the Gospels. Okay, which one? And they picked the book of Matthew, which isn't the one I would choose, but it's been good. Actually, there are biblical texts you want to choose that end up being very illuminating, and Matthew is one of them. And so I've really enjoyed that. And some of my students really get drawn to that. But I have a lot of students who I don't think they'll ever go to church, And their probably only context for the church is the fact that they hung out with our campus ministry. But if I thought about evangelism, I'm thinking of it almost in the sense that Marcus Borg talks about. Can somehow I communicate they are loved, there are communities of support, there's a graciousness to this world. The world's not just a world that's out to get you or out to trick you or out to rip you off. There isn't a God who hates you or is keeping score against you, but there really can be moments of genuine trust in each other and faith in each other, and a world that generates that, and in my faith tradition, a God who supports that. If I can do that, whether they become Christian or not, walk into a church building or not, if they have that experience, it changes everything. And to me, that is genuine good news. Diana Butler Bass kind of puts it in this way. I think I mentioned this before, but I love this paradigm. So basically, the way churches have historically operated is, if you believe the right things, which is, by the way, if you say you go to a church, so where do you go? I go to First Congregational. Well, what do you believe? That's one of the first things, right? You want to study world religions? I've taught world religions. What are the beliefs of Islam or Buddhism or Judaism? That's how historically, if you believe the right things, you can join our club. And then if you join our club, right, and you'll behave in certain ways. You have to think certain things, vote certain ways, believe, act in certain ways. And then you get to belong. Then you're a part of us. And this model is increasingly just it's not addressing any felt needs. The world does not suffer for a lack of beliefs. We have a lot of them out there. But she switches them around. So you start with, you belong, right? You start with belonging. Come, join us, belong with us. And then as you are in community, folks will sort out the ways that you behave, right? The Autism Club, it's amazing how much grace autistic folks will get for each other. when it comes to, everybody's going to have certain kind of skill sets and social skills, and they create allowances for each other because they know each other as somebody on the spectrum, and they negotiate through that. And then third, the beliefs will come. We could talk about our beliefs together, which is what we get to do on Sunday morning, right? We get to talk about what do we believe, and that will emerge. But it emerges because we can do it because we already know we belong. That's the security that allows us to go, I'm not certain about this, or I'm thinking this, but I wonder about this, because I already got the rooting of, and I belong. So not believe, then belong, but belong, and then the beliefs will come. And to be honest, there aren't a lot of spaces for this in our society. In our political life, in our religious life, in our social life. And I would be so bold as to suggest that First Congregation was probably one of the few places in Big Timber where that can occur on that term. And so I think that this church has not that there aren't some other churches that I would trust in this regard, there are, but it's just not very common for people to experience faith communities as places of safety and where community starts the conversation, not what do you believe. And so this church has genuine good news for Big Timber, and it has genuine good news for Montana and the wider community. And I even think there are folks, if they knew what that kind of experience would be like, will be beating themselves up because why weren't they here earlier? Why weren't they enjoying this earlier? So I mentioned that to you to say that I appreciate the fact, or maybe another way to say it is how important your mission is, not only for yourselves and for the people gathered, but for our wider community. And for that, God has apparently decided that you are a vehicle for that. And for that, we give God thanks. Amen. I invite us to join in hymn 28. I just did the third and fourth verses because I always treated this as a nature hymn, and it is a wonderful nature hymn. But verses 3 and 4 speak specifically to community and human life in a way that grabs me. So for the joy of human love, brother, sister, parent, child, friends on earth and friends above, for all gentle thoughts and mild, God of all, to you we raise this our hymn of grateful praise. For the good that love inspires, for a world where none exclude, for a faith that never tires, and for every heart renewed. God of all, to you we raise this our hymn